Welcome to the Orthocast. Today we have Jeem Apologetics, a fellow Zoomer, a fellow debunker. He's debunked Muslims and Jews, and he gets really in-depth in the theology. And he does this all on YouTube, so go subscribe to him on YouTube. He's growing a lot of good content. And he's actually a cradle Orthodox. So my first question for you, Jeem, is how was it, being raised Orthodox? Like, what was that upbringing like? And I know a lot of people that are raised in whatever faith. Maybe they fall away at some points and then they come back maybe later in life, or they end up just unaffiliated. So how did you keep your faith, and did you ever fall away, or what was that upbringing like, and why are you so strong in your faith now?
Well, first of all, Kyle, thank you very much for having me on this discussion. And I guess I'll jump right into the meat of the subject. Little background, I was raised in a mixed Eastern Catholic and Orthodox household, so I'm familiar with both theologies and both traditions, though a part of my family was also Melkite, so that's very similar, obviously, liturgically and aesthetically to Orthodoxy. But growing up Orthodox, I guess when you're a kid, you don't really think about it because you're not going on the internet. And when I was a little kid, we didn't have YouTube or anything, so I wasn't looking up oh, what does a Protestant liturgy look like?
Yeah.
So I didn't know any of this stuff. I just assumed, well, this is Christianity. Everyone must be doing the same thing, right?
Yeah.
I had gone to a Catholic school, and again, as a youth, not knowing any of these differences, I just assumed this is a different way of Orthodoxy. Eventually, as I grew older, I came to know the differences, and for me, it was always intrinsically tied with Lebanese culture and kind of the immigrant attitude that my family had coming over from the Middle East.
Yeah.
But what makes me resolute in my faith today is not just the fact that I was brought up in it, though that does give me a lot of great feelings of nostalgia and comfort where I don't feel like I'm an outsider. So that is a luxury that a lot of the people who are cradle Orthodox or are from a mixed family with a lot of Orthodox would feel. But definitely growing up, I was already and I've talked to other cradle Orthodox about this subject, I was already in such a beautiful religion that you kind of take it for granted, honestly. And there are a lot of cradle Orthodox who just go, well, this is just I'm Serbian, for example. This is just the religion of Serbia. And they don't really put a lot of thought into it sometimes. Yeah. Not to be disparaging, but, when you step back and you really try to study theology and you look at all these other religions, from the Orthodox perspective, a lot of them, most of them, if not all of them, seem very lacking. So I was very surprised when I started to learn more about other denominations of Christianity as well as other religions. I just assumed all religions had the amount of depth and spirit and history and just tremendous knowledge, symbolism, and allegory that is found in Orthodox Christianity. So I guess growing up, you kind of used to it, and you don't see it from the outside. A lot of people who are recent converts, maybe not as recent, even people from 5-10 years ago, they come from a background or a tradition of Christianity that is not as rich spiritually, liturgically, so they can see the power of it. And so for a lot of cradles, one of the drawbacks is just you don't know how good you have it until you don't have it, is how I would answer that.
Yeah. And also, one thing that's interesting about Lebanon is you kind of get that influence of all the different religions, because there's Muslims there, there's the influence of Israel. And you debunk a lot of rabbinical Jews and Judaism. So how did you get interested on that? You had a really good recent video on Tovia Singer and, talking about the Trinity. So how did that come?
Okay, that began because honestly, I almost looked at it in a businessman perspective when looking at YouTube. And I just saw so much content focusing on Islam, and that's fine because this is an enormous religion, and of all the religions that don't just sit back, Islam is not the religion that sits back. And by that I mean just Christians existing, they have to come in and go, oh, here's why you're wrong and here's why our theology is better. And in fairness, there are some Christians who do that too, but number one, the biggest competition for Christianity as a whole is Islam. So there's not a bad thing that people are focusing on it, but I just didn't see a lot of refutation of Judaism. Whenever you look up, refuting Judaism, it's just kind of 4chan guys talking about the Jews in a political or racial way. That's not really my my forte. So I didn't see too much. There are some people, like Sam Shamoun has gone all in on Judaism before. He really does not care for Tovia Singer. There's a
Yeah.
lot of people who don't, but he's really the only big name I know of who really went after it very early on. I know Jay Dyer
Yeah.
has a video that I saw on the Dyer Clips channel, where he talks about how even the oneness concept in Judaism doesn't really exist. There isn't really a one simple God in Judaism. If anything, they have a doctrine of understanding God that makes the Trinity look like less complicated in comparison, if you know what I mean. I mean,
Yeah.
the Sephirot, Kabbalah, all this crazy stuff. And so the reason I got into it was partly because no one else was really touching it.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, because Islam and Rabbinic Judaism are intrinsically linked. Not
Yeah.
saying the same exact person concocted both religions, but they borrow and share a lot together. And this isn't like a hidden thing. I mean, if you ask Muslims or Jews, who are you closer to, they'll both answer each other than Christianity. And the reason for that is they'll give vague answers like, well, you know, we have the true monotheism like the Jews do,
Yeah.
and vice versa. But in reality, it's the ritualism and the spirituality of the Talmud is found quite seriously in Islam. There are a few instances of it almost being copied word for word, but beyond that, even just if you could, this is a simple Google search, you could look up the similarities between Islamic law and Rabbinic Jewish law. They're extremely similar, and all these Rabbinic Jewish laws are coming from the Talmud. This is not even the law of Moses. This is spirituality that's 350 to 500 years after Christ already goes to heaven.
Yeah.
So this is like a redaction of their own faith. This isn't the law of Moses found in the Torah. The
Yeah.
Talmud supersedes the Torah. Anyway, so to round all that off, Tovia Singer, for those unaware, is just a very famous internet rabbi, lives in Indonesia. He's got a big thing for always, you know, pandering to Islam. I think most of his viewers are Muslims or ex-Christians. And I found that a lot of what he says and a lot of what the people say on that channel to be an echo. You know, he'll say something that could very easily be refuted, but because of the people who are watching him are in favor of him, they're not going to look for that knowledge.
Yeah.
So if he says something that is incorrect or he's diminishing what the actual truth is, people aren't going to check. And so Tovia is kind of the biggest guy. When I think of who are the religious Jews who just have a problem with Christianity in the theology circle of YouTube, the first name that pops into my head is Tovia Singer.
Yeah.
And he's made a career out of, you know, debunking the Trinity and Paul and all this stuff, and he doesn't really debunk them. In fact, most of his arguments are atheistic arguments. You know, he'll use stuff like, well, how is the gospel reliable? But he doesn't use that own standard when it comes to his Talmuds, which are separated with a much greater chasm from the Torah than our gospels are. So yeah, that's the reason I got into it. I noticed there was a niche group of people who were not really being addressed that much by Orthodoxy or by the wider Christian net, because it's always Christianity Islam on YouTube. And I thought, hey, you know, we can't ignore this, because
Yeah.
like people just assume, I don't know, like what you were talking about. As a kid, I was just taught, oh, the Jews are just Christians with the Old Testament. And that could not be like further from
Yeah.
the truth. I do want to clarify one thing though. You know, there are actually a lot of rabbinic Jews in my family, not in like my bloodline, but my dad remarried. And so he remarried an Ashkenazi Jew, and she's a perfectly nice person, and I really like all her family. So I have nothing like against them personally.
Yeah.
Because I know you say the word Jew, people start freaking out, like,
Yeah.
oh, you're attacking the race. I have nothing wrong with the
It's a
racial
theology.
but-
We care about
Exactly.
their souls. Like, you know, like the Trinity is all throughout the Old Testament. Like I'm reading Kingdoms right now, and it's like the Lord appeared to Solomon. How does that make any sense? How does the Lord appear to Solomon? And there's all these instances of that just don't make any sense unless God is Trinity.
Right.
Yeah.
And if God can enter creation, which
Yeah.
Judaism and Islam both disbelieve. So you'll see a lot of, you know, people talk all the time, oh, Christians are coping, they're trying to find the Trinity in the Old Testament. It's, if anything, it's Rabbinic Judaism coping. Because every time the Lord appears, like the plain text,
Yeah.
which Moses wrote, we all believe Moses wrote it, the Torah, the Lord appears. We could just take that at face value, or we could do what the Rabbinic Jews do, which is invent entire things that are not present there. Like, yes,
Yeah.
they'll say the angel of the Lord is not really God, even though he is worshipped and glorified and speaks as God. But in addition to that, if you look at Genesis 18:19, there is no mention of the angel of the Lord. It just says the Lord shows up. And they still, if you look at the rabbinic commentary, they'll say, well, that must have been an angel. It says 3 men show up to Abraham, right? But only 2 of them are called angels, and the third one is only called the Lord. Not even the angel of the Lord, just the Lord. How do they explain that? Nobody knows, because God can't enter creation. So,
Yeah.
so if anything, I wanted to make these videos to dispel the notion that Rabbinic Judaism has like an ownership over the Old Testament, and that anything they say, you know, counts more than what Christians say. That's like in secular culture, people just assume that, oh, they're Jewish, they were there first, it's their text. Well, that could not be further from the truth. So that's
Yeah.
why I got into it.
Yeah. No, that was perfectly said. I hope to see more videos from you. Maybe some debates in the future. That would be really awesome to see.
Love to get into that.
Yeah. But what about the like spirituality differences? Because I feel like rabbinical Judaism, it's even like more legalist. It's so like legalistic, and it's all about like ritualistic cleanliness, or like, well, how would you say the differences are?
Right. So if you asked a Jew that question, rabbinic Jew, religious Jew, I specify because it's like 50% of Jews aren't really religious at all.
Yeah.
So if you ask a religious Jew that question, they'll say, well, we're just following Moses. But in reality, even though, yes, there were many ritual laws given to the children of Israel, to the Israelites, under tutelage of Moses from God himself, those were meant for a specific time and place. And even then, many of the laws concerning that are liturgical. The tabernacle, the temple, all the imagery inside the tabernacle, the temple, the ark, the manner in which they pray, the incense. You don't see any of that in Judaism today. So they can't use the excuse that that's the Old Testament religion, because by that logic, where are your sacrifices? Where are your priests? That's not the Old Testament religion. So today's Judaism, I said earlier, was a kind of a redaction. And what I meant by that is that they took elements of what they had believed in and mixed it with entirely new spirituality, simply to react to Christianity. To say all these Christians are running around saying God is three persons and one of the persons became man, so Christ is God. And they're like, well, the ones who didn't convert were saying, well, how do we refute these kind of ideas? I mean, they're using our same book. So they compiled the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud. And in that is where all their spirituality comes from. You said it correctly. They are very ritualistic, but it's even further than, and people don't understand this because nobody reads the Talmud, but it's even further than the ritualism found in the Torah, because it's specific to not just the children of Israel at that time and place, which everyone agrees was a special prophetic lineage. Now the prophets are done according to Christianity and to Judaism. They're just waiting for the Messiah. All the other prophets are done. And so their version of spirituality is not really a good imitation of the Mosaic law at all. And you'll see that much of what they do is all concerning about just them. So many of their laws are preferring themselves, the rabbinic Jews, to all of the rest of the world. And you can even see this kind of mirrored in Islam with, the Muslim gets this, the people of the book, Jews and Christians and others, they get that. They're inferior to Muslims in Islam. They're not as bad as like pure pagans, but anything they do, Islam does better. And that's the same thing with Judaism. Anything the Gentiles are doing, it's wrong if it's not helping Judaism. It's wrong if it's not helping the religion or the people. If there are laws such as, if a Gentile harms a Jew, he has the right to react violently, even to death, and it's not even considered a crime. And some of these people could just say, well, that's like an ethno-religious cult, whatever you want to call it. Those laws are there and they are practiced. It is very ethnic based. They don't believe in the concept of universal salvation. They have their laws for the Jews, and then lately people like Tovia Singer have been saying, well, the Gentiles have the Noahide laws, but that has like never been practiced in all of history. Maybe not even 1% compared to the population of the Jews themselves, which themselves are not even 1% of the entire earth. This is like the weakest evangelism of all time. They can't use the excuse like, oh, well, all that stuff is just for us. You Gentiles should have been following the Noahide laws. Well, then why don't you tell everyone to do it? But they don't. So, I mean, a lot of their spirituality is ritual-based, also very inward-based. Everything is about them. And even, this is a departure from, even Islam doesn't go this far. But, they consider God their father. I don't know the extent to how different that is to how we view God, as the Father, God the Father. But one of the elements of that is that there are parts of the Talmud where they will trick and circumvent God. And there's even a part of the Talmud, I can look it up, where God says, my children have bested me. So So the Jews are they're smarter than God. I mean, it's such
my
a
gosh.
departure
Yeah.
from what's in the Old Testament. It makes absolutely no sense. And one thing I'll leave you with, they say Jesus can't be accountable for all the sins of mankind, and yet there is a festival where they transfer all of their sins to a live animal, in most cases a chicken. You see this even in like Brooklyn in New York. And that chicken will take on the weight of their entire sin. Then they will kill it, and its sacrifice has saved that person, that practicing Jewish person, from the sin of the entire year. And then they do it again the next year. So if a chicken has the power to take on one person's sin, why can't God take on the sin of mankind? Because he loves us.
Yeah.
There's not really a good logical question for that. If the chicken is more powerful than God, I mean, what's going on here? So that's part of that's part of their very strange beliefs that most people are unaware of.
Yeah, I've noticed all that like contradictions. Like they say like, oh, how can a man take all of our sins? But example like that. And then also saying like, well, we never believe that God can become incarnate in man. But they look for their prophet in a Messiah. Like I'm pretty sure there's one right now. They're like, oh, Israel's Messiah has come in. So it's like they contradict themselves. And it seems like the Talmud is just like a reaction to, to Christ and Revelation. They're like, well, some of them, they don't like that, so they make their own book, and a lot of it, like reading about this book, Jesus in the Talmud, is just an entire polemic against Christianity and Jesus. So we just got to pray for them. But next, that kind of brings into Islam, and so since Islam copied a lot of this, like from the Talmud, we can see all of these like similarities, like in the way they pray. In the way they pray and everything, we can see that Muslims copied a lot from Jews and Christians. So what would you say some of those similarities are, because it can refute Islam too?
Right. I'll talk about the general, like not shallow, but like the surface layer similarities, and then I'll minimize this window, and then I want to look at a few verses that are like strikingly similar to the Talmud, which many Muslims have readily said, yeah, we know, that's a good thing. But it logically doesn't make a lot of sense. So when it comes to their prayer style, you'll notice that, and a lot of people don't know this, but when Jews pray, as Christians should as well, many of them will prostrate. So they'll bow down to the floor and they'll pray to God. That's obviously one surface level thing that we can say all the Abrahamic religions do or should be doing. I don't know why Protestants and Catholics don't, but the rest of us do. So anyone who says, well, the Jews invented it and only Muslims do it now, well, we all do. It's not my fault if someone chooses not to. But that's just one little example. Another example is, of course, the ritualism, but also the legalism. And the legalism to a point where you're racking up points in Islam. They have a concept called good deeds. And there can be very menial tasks like drinking water while sitting down is a good deed. And if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, when you go to paradise, well, I mean, that will get you into paradise if your good deeds are greater than your bad deeds. Not every single time. There may be exceptions if a person is like absolutely a vile, volatile human being. But the whole point of it is that spirituality, the lacking of intention, as the apostle St. Paul tells us, don't always focus on the outward circumcision, but look at the circumcision on the inside. So rather than just the circumcision of the flesh, how about the circumcision of the heart? And he talks about this because Jesus just resurrected and went to heaven. And already a couple decades later, and even sooner than that, people are going back and going, okay, that's great. Jesus saved us all. But I got to do all these weird laws or else God won't save me. And Paul is sitting there wondering, but aren't you contradicting yourself? You're saying Jesus saved you, but it's not enough because you have to do these other laws. And so for Christianity, especially Orthodoxy, we take a lot of the moral example from the Old Testament. It's not completely disregarded. We don't follow the ritual laws because we don't believe these laws can save you in and of themselves. We believe Christ saves us, but we live a holy life so that we can attain a further path toward God and to reach paradise. But Christ is the ultimate Savior. That's it. These laws by themselves are not going to save you. And so that's why Paul says that Jesus is a stumbling block both to the pagan Greeks who relied only on philosophy and wisdom and on the Jews who were obsessed with the laws. He said Jesus is a stumbling block to them because it refutes their ideas that you have to run around in circles a certain number of times in order to get to heaven. And when I say that, you look at Islam, there are rules of hygiene. And many of them, okay, they make some sense. Wash before you pray. That's fine. People know the surface level laws. But there's other ones, such as washing a bowl a certain number of times is the only way
Oh,
to properly follow the Sunnah. So the Sunnah is following what Muhammad did, and that's what the Sunni Muslims do. They follow it based on the sayings, collections of a few books, including the entire Hadith collection, or the ones that they consider to be authentic. And so they're mimicking this guy, and that's a whole other issue entirely, but they're mimicking this guy in everything, not just out of admiration, but because the Quran says, obey God and the messenger. So they have to obey this guy and do all of his laws, or you're not following that command from the Quran.
yeah.
And so another thing that I found interesting, in addition to just the idea of ritualism and the idea of legalism, to go back to what St. Paul was saying, is that the intention is not really there. So yeah, there is a prayer that Muslims do before praying, where it's optional, where they give their intent, and they say, "Okay, God, I intend to do this prayer for so and so reasons." But even that, ironically, even that is not really giving your intent, because you're just doing a robotic ritual stating your intent. But inward in your heart, you may not have a good intention. And so they lack the idea that there is an intention inside and that a change inward is
Yeah.
more important than outward. Jesus tells us when you fast, anoint your head, wash your hair, look healthy. Don't be walking around with your clothes torn and you look all miserable so people can go, "Oh, he's fasting. How admirable of him." Or, when you donate, go and do it secretly. Don't announce, "Guys, I'm giving my zakat." That's the charity, the concept of charity. And then there's also when you pray, go secretly into your room, shut the door, and pray to God. That's what Christ tells us. But in Islam and Judaism, these concepts are not really there at all because they don't have the teachings of Christ. So all
Yeah.
they have is we have the one God, we have to pray to him, but you'll find, especially in Islam, that sometimes they take a lot of pride in these prayers. I've had Muslim friends announce to me like 5 times in a 30-minute span that they have to get up and pray. Just go do it. I don't need to
Yeah.
know. My grandmother, she went to a Muslim friend's house, Lebanese as well. And in the middle of a conversation, he just gets up and starts doing all of his prostrations and praying, like in the middle of the dining room. Whereas the Christian concept is go to your private place and pray. It's not really anybody else's business unless we're in liturgy. You're not going to gain points from your peers, and their points don't even matter compared to the judgment that you receive from Christ. So those are, in terms of spirituality, those are the things that are extremely important. And then again, there's a long, long list of laws that are very, very similar compared to Islam and Judaism, like divorces and many other things. But I do, if you don't mind, I want to read a couple of passages that are
Yeah, go ahead.
strikingly similar.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
So in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, in verse 32, so that's chapter 5, verse 32, it states, "That is why we ordained for the children of Israel that whoever takes a life, unless as a punishment for murder or mischief in the land, it will be as if they killed all of humanity. And whoever saves a life, it will be as if they saved all of humanity." Then if we look at the Sanhedrin from the Babylonian Talmud, there's also other translations that are slightly different, but you get the idea that the Quran, which is not just a book written by Muhammad, it's the authentic revelation of God, says if you kill someone, it's as if you kill all of humanity. If you save someone, it's as if you save all of humanity. And the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, says the exact same thing, almost word for word. The issue with this is that the Talmud came first. The Talmud is not considered, even by Islam's own standards, to be the Word of God, because it came after the Torah, which is considered the Old Testament. The whole thing is called the Torah, or Al-Torah in Islam, or the Injil, which is the Gospel for the Christians. Those are the only two holy books that are considered part of the revelation of God. The Talmud is never mentioned in the Quran, and yet these verses are copied almost word for word from it. I also possess another interesting part right here, where Riyad al-Salihin 419, Abu Huraira, may Allah be pleased with him, this is a hadith reported, "I heard the Messenger of Allah saying, when Allah created the creature, he wrote in the book, which is with him over his throne, verily my mercy prevailed over my wrath." So God, this is a different one, this is in a hadith, not the Quran. And in the hadith it says, in the throne in heaven, God has a verse over his throne, so above him, verily my mercy prevailed over my wrath. But then we have in a Jewish book, which again I'll share the sources with you. The Gemara asks, "What does God pray?" Rav Zutra Bartovia said, God says, "May it be my will that my mercy will overcome my anger." So in the Jewish source, my mercy will overcome my anger. And in the Hadith, above the very throne of God, verily my mercy prevailed over my wrath, which is pretty much the same concept. So you can see those are two examples, and I'm sure there are more, of exact, almost exact copying from the Talmud, which again, people may say, well, isn't that just part of the continuity that Islam teaches? No, because the Talmud is not one of the revelations given to the people prior to the rise of Islam. So before Muhammad, the only books that are considered revelation, like I said, are the Torah, the Old Testament, and the Injil, the Gospels that Jesus had. That's it. There is no Talmud. There is no sacred Talmud in Islam, and yet it still copies just about word for word what those passages say.
Yeah.
And the problem with the first one that I read was that it's from the Quran itself, which is supposed to be the eternal word of God. So God, before all of time, before all of creation, decides, I'm going to write these verses because I know in the future, at some point, some random Jews are going to write a book without my authority, and in that book, they're going to write something that is going to be the exact copy of what I have over this throne. And it's so important, so integral, that I have to put it into the Quran, my eternal word, that is not me, but also not apart from me. I wrote this before the entire cosmos was created in Islamic theology. That's what God did.
Yeah.
And yet, it's not even from his own revelation. It's from what some Jews decided was the wisdom of God. So that doesn't really make any sense. And the Hadith is not much better, even though it's not an uncreated, timeless piece. It's copying my mercies prevailed over my wrath. So those are two examples right there.
That's what I never really found convincing about Islam, is it really just like, it kind of popped up in the 6th century, and they kind of have like an ad hoc response of like, oh, the Bible, it's corrupted unless it agrees with the Quran. Or even, you're bringing up these clear examples of the Talmud, which they don't even think, like, that's just not a part of it at all. But it's like clear that it copied that. It's just they don't really have any good explanations for the lack of continuity of like who was practicing Islam before. They kind of act like Jehovah's Witnesses, where they're like, oh, everyone, they were secretly like it just means to submit to Allah or something. But it's just
they were so good at it they didn't tell anyone.
Yeah, exactly.
To add on to that, you want me to continue? I just have one.
Yeah.
To add on to that, it's not just these verses, which of course are very striking and troubling. It's also the fact that there are other parts that, like you said, it shows up in the 6th century, invasions in the 7th century, the rise of Islam. It all seems to be very focused on this one region, which again is okay if you're looking at it from the historical Jewish, or the Christian mindset, which is, oh, these are books written by men. They're going to have their own context, their own flaws personally, but the Holy Spirit is going to move them to infallibly write these great holy scriptures, right? That's what we believe. But it's still men at the end of the day. So Paul, he can't be time traveling into Soviet Russia. He's going to write from the perspective of someone who is in the 1st century in a Hellenistic Jewish culture, and that is what he writes as. But the problem that I find in Islam is that, specifically with the Quran, everything seems to be pertaining to things that happen in a very small area of the world. Arabia is a large, vast space, but most of everything that occurs in the revelation that Muhammad gives to all of his companions and the people who follow him just occurs in the Hijaz region, which is the strip of western Saudi Arabia. That is where the vast majority of everything happens. And there are groups that are mentioned that no longer exist. For example, the Quran says that the Jews call Ezra the son of God, and yet there are no Jews today who do. Furthermore, it says that the Christians worship Mary as a goddess. And some Muslims will say, well, Catholics and Orthodox pray to Mary. But it clearly is saying worship as a goddess. And there's even a verse in the Quran, in that very same surah that I read from, where apparently on Judgment Day, God is going to ask Jesus, did you take yourself and your mother as gods? So not a saint, because Islam is actually aware, maybe not the Quran, but later books and later scholarly work from them, they're aware of what saintly veneration is. There actually are saints in some parts of Sunni Islam. It's not the exact same as what we have, but they know the difference between venerating and worship. And yet God still asks Jesus on the end times, did you take yourself as a God, which is wrong theologically to begin with, because Christians don't believe Jesus is a God. We believe he is God. He's one with God. So Allah should be saying, did you take yourself to be one with me? Not a different ilah. Ilah just means a God. And yet he asks, did you and your mother take yourself as gods? So that's a very clear statement. And again, we have to go back to the idea that this is an uncreated book. And yet God is only addressing really fringe Jewish groups that call Ezra the son of God. And the so-called Calidrians that worshipped Mary as a goddess. But these are around for like 15 years and then they get wiped out. So why, before all of creation, are these groups so troubling that they must be put into this eternal book? Why isn't the rest of Christianity, which has remained the largest religion of all time, up from, the last 1,000 years has been the largest religion of all time, at least. Why isn't their theology addressed? Why these weird heretics who have like nothing to do with anything? That's what's like not very convincing to me when I look at that. That would be something I did want to bring up there.
Yeah, because the Quran is supposed to be absolutely perfect. Because, like you said, it was eternal, like directly from Quran. Versus like the Bible, it is divinely inspired, but is like written, by men. But it's still infallible. But it's just like it's different. If you just find one error, even like a copyist error in the Quran, it proves that it's not the eternal book it's claiming to be.
Right, and we don't say the Bible is eternal. So it can address stuff that happened 5 minutes ago in that time period. It's like, okay, that makes sense because the writer was there. But like, it's not an eternal book.
Next, I want to talk about, you recently had a discussion with the Muslim metaphysician. So how was that? Because I've seen a few of his videos and it's just they aren't good at all. He's like, he was for context, he was like a Catholic before, but he like didn't understand the Trinity, and now he is a Muslim. So in that discussion you were talking about the Trinity, right? So how was that?
It wasn't a debate. He was just doing a like, hey, Christians, come on into Mosque Square kind of he has a problem with Sam Shamoun, but that's actually the exact same thing Shamoun does. So I found that interesting. But so I decided I'm gonna hop on and see what this lad is all about. And so it wasn't a debate. I just was asking him questions because I wanted to gauge what is his knowledge. So I brought up the monarchia, and he said, well, the monarchia doesn't solve the logical problem of the Trinity. And I was like, okay, fine, if you say so. But you must, of course, because he had made a video where he like responded to Kai from Orthodox Shahada and Lewis. And he said, oh, these guys are nonsense. They're not learned. Their monarchia doesn't do anything. But then when I asked him about it, he said, okay, the monarchia is actually better than the filioque Trinity. Because in the filioque, you run into the problem of an unlimited amount of persons, because the Father, we can have procession from the Father and from the Son, so why can't something proceed from the Holy Spirit? That's one example he gave. That even that's not really a perfect argument. But he admitted, okay, the monarchia is superior in many ways. I mentioned an interview / a debate he had with Dr. Bo Branson, which I have watched, and his obsession seems to come with the multiplicity of the persons of God, so the Trinity. And his issue is that this is so hard for a mortal to wrap their mind around. It's no matter what you do, it's still three gods in his mind. And when you were right that he used to be a Roman Catholic, he left because he couldn't understand the Trinity. But then he gets into Islam, and he's made other short videos where he's like, I first got into Islam and I didn't know the complexity of all this theology. And Sam Shamoun made a great comment on that. He said, well, look at this. And this is common in a lot of people who leave Christianity to become Muslim. The Trinity was too much for them, so they have to leave on theological grounds because they don't understand it. But now when they go to Islam and they get into the deep stuff, it becomes just as, if not more complicated than the Trinity. But now that's not enough to leave Islam. Now that's okay. They can tough that out. Why couldn't they tough out the Trinity? And it's a perfectly good question to ask. So the whole thing was basically just me talking about Orthodoxy, talk about the differences between that and the Western theologies. I asked him if he would like to debate Kai or Lewis. He said, no, those guys are clowns. They don't know anything. I was like, okay, fine. You call them clowns. If you are, and I thought, well, who's great at metaphysics? Jay Dyer. So I said, would you debate Jay Dyer? He goes, absolutely. I would love to debate Jay Dyer, but he's avoiding me. He doesn't want to debate me. And I was like, this is your channel, whatever you say, man. But like, I
I
was just, I know that Jay had actually mentioned this once before that
yeah.
he had wanted to do a debate with Eminem, and
Mhm.
it just didn't go through because there were a lot of preconditions to that debate, and I don't know the full
Yeah,
veracity of it, but it's like he
I
didn't
actually
want a debate.
yeah, I actually made
Eminem,
a
I mean.
on Dire Clips. I made a video about the Muslim metaphysician exposed because what Jay did is he gave him the same exact conditions that he gave the other Muslims in the debate. But what's his name? Muslim metaphysician Jake. He wanted like even more time, and so Jay didn't agree to that because he's like, no, you're just going to get what everyone else gets. And then Jake said, no, I want double the time. And then after Jay said no, then Jake's like, oh, you're just scared of me. But it's like, no, Jay literally gave him the same exact as like actual Muslim scholars like Shabir Ali. And I mean, Jay's debated a lot of Muslims. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think Asrar Rashid was on there as well. That was a good debate.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shabir Ali is like a household name. I mean, a lot of like
Yeah.
very conservative, like Hanbali Sunnis will say, "Oh, he's not real. He's not good enough." But everyone knows who that is. This is a distinguished scholar and
Yeah.
Muslim metaphysician, and this is one of my problems with him. He goes, "Nobody understands the Trinity but me." And
Yeah.
that's a real issue. You've had 1400 years of trying to answer this question, and now this guy is the
Yeah.
solution.
This
That brings two
convert.
problems.
Yeah.
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 Two problems. One is pride, and two, if 1400 years of scholars can't address it properly, that's a problem, man. Like how
It
how are
is.
how are you pridefully saying like I am the one? Shabir Ali, he doesn't know the Trinity like I do. Like,
Yeah.
what is he talking? Shabir knows what it is. He just isn't like a metaphysics expert. Everyone has their strength and weakness. And that was also an excellent debate, Shabir and Jay Dyer. But yeah,
Yeah.
I just found that so absurd that the hopefully he will debate him. Hopefully he'll just say, let's debate him.
Yeah.
So I remember there was Hamza something
Oh yeah.
from the Lion's Den
Mhm.
wanted to debate Seraphim Hamilton, and then I don't think that ever went through. He's like, debate me, Seraphim. And he's like, okay.
Yeah. No,
And then nothing.
yeah, I remember that. Seraphim sent out a debate challenge and then he just didn't debate. So it was just
It just fizzled out. Like,
Yeah.
are you gonna do it? Nothing.
I would
He's scared. I'm gonna rinse you. Like, all right,
Yeah.
do it.
I would love to see
Weird.
that debate with Cobain. But next I want to, switch gears and talk about, Christianity in the Arab world because the Arabs were some of the first people to embrace Christianity. So, if you want to talk about, the past history and, the history of what's going on right now in the Middle East.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'll try to keep it as lean as possible. But when we use the word Arab, and I have to get into this. When we use the word Arab, it covers a very wide net.
Yeah.
So when people think of different ethnicities in the world, you might think like Italians. Well, that's a very cohesive ethnicity, but Arab is not really one ethnicity. It could be argued there is one original ethnicity, and the tribal Arabs would be upholding that and its culture the most. But
Yeah.
for us, an Arab basically means your father is an Arab, you have Arab lineage, and you practice the culture. The widest, most lukewarm definition would be you just speak Arabic. I'm in the middle. I don't believe that just anybody learning it becomes an Arab necessarily. Anyway, so in the history, many of the people that are Arabs today, they had identified as different identities before. So where my family's from, in Lebanon, the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Syrian Levantine coast, was a mixture of a kind of Hellenized Byzantine population that spoke Semitic languages as well as Greek. And then the inward, more rural parts were Syriac or Aramaic, which is extremely close to the exact dialect that our Lord Christ spoke when he was
Yeah.
on earth. And so it was a great mix. It's not like you can just click the modern borders of Syria, paint it all one ethnicity. There are many different languages. Syriac is an extremely important and underrated language for all of Christian history. In all of the major denominations of Christians in the world would be giving themselves a great advantage to read the Syriac wisdom. And
Yeah.
I'll get to why that's important in regards to Islam. Arabs were migrating into the Middle East from the south and the peninsula and the northwest region where they originated. And so there were a lot of Arabs pre-Islam. There's a weird kind of idea people have that, Islam invented Arabic and invented the Arab identity, and, nobody's really an Arab unless you're Muslim. And that's not true. There are accounts of very ancient forms of Arabic, and even the word Arab pops up in the Old Testament like 900 years before Islam, some even older than that. And so when we look at the proper tribal Arabs, and I'll get to the other populations as well, we look at the proper tribal Arabs, the people that Muhammad would have known, would have been around, would have been aware of these tribes. They were a mixture of Orthodox and Oriental Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And they inhabited northwestern Arabia and into the northern part of the Middle East, mainly staying in the kind of rural areas. And this area was also filled with so many different denominations of Judaism. There was Nestorianism, that was also
Yeah.
a sect of Christianity. And so you'll find that all these groups have their tiny little fingerprints across Islamic theology,
Oh.
even in the smallest of ways, because they happen to be in that region. But anyway, the ancient Middle East was not what people assume it to be. There were great, great differences compared to what we see today. Today, you would say, well, the largest single branch of Christianity is Roman Catholicism. Then after that, you have Orthodoxy, and then there's of course many, many Protestants, but they're all divided, so that's not really one sect anymore.
Yeah.
But in the ancient Middle East, you didn't have Catholicism yet, and there was no Protestantism, so you only had Nestorianism and the Oriental churches, and of course the Orthodox Church, which was its heartbeat was from the Byzantine Empire, who the Arabs called the Romans. And so the Orientals had dominion over Egypt, Nubia, so like Sudan and South Sudan, Aksum, which is Ethiopia, as well as parts of southern Arabia and northwestern Arabia and part of Syria. So the Oriental path of Christianity was way more influential back then, and they held occupation of many of the holy seas for a long time. And then, of course, Orthodoxy was the most prominent in the coasts, but then also into the desert as well. And so you see so much interlap, but also a lot of strife. And in this battleground where heresies are popping up, it's not as simple as Christianity starts out, 33 AD, and then we have the big movement, and then like nothing happens, and 600 so years later, Islam shows up. In reality, every century there's a major council going on. One
Yeah.
by one, these little heresies creep in. You have Arianism and Nestorianism. The Oriental churches leave as well. These are all in like the 400s. And then not long after that, we have, boom, the Talmud, and then boom, right after that, immediately Islam. So
Yeah.
the idea that there's this huge gap and, nothing happens in Christianity and then Islam comes out of nowhere. In reality, it's like a downward slope of all these heresies. And then Islam happens to pop up as like a unification of many different religious groups. But yeah, I mean, it would do people a lot of advantages to look at the Syriac history because the poetic style, and this is a subject which is still being theorized and people are leaning into it more, but the poetic style of Aramaic-speaking Christians has a lot of sway over the style of recitation and poetry in the Quran, it can be argued. So the wisdom of Saint Ephraim and the wisdom of many other Syriac priests and psalmists and poets, they were speaking to their people in a way that's very reminiscent of how the Quran speaks to its own prophet. Like you'll see in brackets if you're reading it in English, like, say, O prophet, blah, 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 because it's God telling Muhammad, say this to the people. But we also have Aramaic sources where we have some things that are very similar in the Syriac. So, chapter 1, say to the audience of that church, since you are the priest, this, and that. And so you see that poetic style being mirrored in the Quran itself. And this was primarily amongst the Aramaics, and then the Syriacs, and then in Egypt you had the Copts. And what were they doing? They were memorizing the Psalms of the Old Testament in Coptic and chanting it for hours and hours every day, because to them, this was God-breathed scripture. So if they're chanting it, it's like God is breathing through them, and that's how they become closer to God. And so when you put all these pieces together, the idea that the idea of recitation in a Semitic language does not suddenly seem like a brand new idea. You see all these different Christian groups doing things that are very similar. Look at the Tewahedo churches of Ethiopia. They remove their shoes. Well, actually, all Oriental churches, they remove their shoes. I think the Copts and the Syriacs remove their shoes before the Eucharist. But the Ethiopian church removes their shoes before even entering a church. They leave them outside. The men and women are separated. The women have to be veiled. Everyone has to bathe in some kind of ritual water before going into the church. And many other things that are very similar to Islam. Because in Islam, You go to the masjid, you have to take off your shoe, you have to wash yourself. Men and women are separated. And so we see all these when you put all these together, it's not like there's one source that Islam just said, I'm gonna copy that. But if you put
Yeah.
the Talmud and then the Tawahedo Church and the Orientals and the Orthodoxy, all of this together, and you start to see, oh, this is where these pieces are being formed. And so that's kind of how the past was. But a lot of Arab Christians look back on it with a lot of pride that for a long time, for like 700 years, we were the heart of Christendom. And so many of the great fathers came from Egypt, Alexandria,
Yeah.
and from Antioch. And so there's a great history there. But moving on into the modern day Middle East, I mean, yeah, like if you look at the news, it seems very bleak and hey, it's not fun, but it's not really fun for anyone in the region. And I'm not trying to not make Christians victims because they are in many ways. But I also don't want, because there's a lot of Arab Christians that feel so victimized that they can't stand up and say, no, I have a heritage to be proud of. And so I want my people to be proud of their heritage and not just always feel like the tiny little minority getting bullied. You know,
Yeah.
there were times when Muslims and Christians got along decently in the Middle East. Recently, because of all the wars, it has not been a good time ever since at least 100 years ago. Lebanon has the most Christians per capita of the Middle East. Egypt has the most by sheer number. But Lebanon is about maybe 40% Christian today.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with just Christians have left in the last century or so. I mean, it's a small area, but Muslims are leaving at the same rate now, so it's kind of evening out. And so in Lebanon, you have a mix, but the largest group are the Maronites, who are Syriac Eastern Catholics. Then number two on the Christian list would actually be us, the Orthodox.
Mhm.
They're about 8 to 10% of the whole population of Lebanon, which is pretty good, just for one sect to be 10%, not even counting the Maronites there. And then you have Greek Catholics, Armenians, and many other groups that are smaller. In Syria, we have probably the largest group of Orthodox in the Middle East. I think there's around a million or so, and or at least before the war there were. And so the Christians as a total are like 12% of Syria, and the Orthodox of that 12 are like they're 9% out of 12. So they're the
Yeah.
great majority there in Syria. Jordan has a small amount. Same with Palestine. Most of them have left. Um, you know, not easy over there. And then Egypt, of
Yeah.
course, the largest Christian group are the Copts. But yeah, I mean, it's a country to country thing. But Lebanon's the only place where Christians can kind of walk around with giant guns and like huge crosses and just
Yeah.
piss people off because like they know no one can do anything because Christians have a lot of power there, and sometimes they're very overly antagonistic, but that's just how it is. In Syria, you see that they used to get along very well, and now they're kind of in an uneasy spot between the Assad government and like all the weird fringe groups that want to destroy the country. In Jordan, they're just kind of like very small minority. And then I guess in Egypt, you've got a case of since 2014, a lot of fanaticism and terrorism coming from even, and that's the problem. Egypt is so populated that even if
Yeah.
only 2% of Muslims are bad and 98% are good, which is probably closer to the truth there. Only if only 2% hate the Copts, that's still a problem. That's like
Yeah.
millions of
I
people.
think there's like
It's such a big country.
yeah, I think there's like 100 million people in Egypt, so that's like 2 million people. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So even if
that's
only 3%, 2% don't like them, it's still a big deal.
yeah. But Lebanon's really interesting because, like you were saying, there's the Maronites, the Orthodox, and then there's also the Melkites. And I actually, when I was still Catholic, I tried out a Melkite Greek church, and that was really interesting
Yeah.
because it was like it's split from the Greek Orthodox Church, but like the Melkites were like a specific their own specific like group. And so when I went to the
Right.
liturgy, it was very much it was a divine liturgy, an Eastern Catholic divine liturgy, and they did everything like the Orthodox do, but they also retained their like the saying it in Arabic. But yeah, I think it was like in the 1700s that the Maronites and Melkites kind of like basically the Catholic Church kind of came in and they kind of like persuaded them with like money and political influence, and they kind of I think the Maronites are now like kind of one of the most Latinized Eastern Catholics versus the Melkites are probably like the least Latinized.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so you're right about the Melkites, though one minor correction. The
yeah,
Maronites, they claim to have always been Catholic, so they're the
oh,
only Eastern Catholic group that was not like they used to be Orthodox or Oriental and then they became Catholic.
hmm,
But the Melkites, that's spot on. I mean, they're probably one of, if not the least Latinized by far. I mean,
yeah,
they don't even say the Filioque in their liturgy. It's
yeah,
just like Why doesn't the Pope have a problem with that? Like, you guys are
Yeah.
professing this is the reason for the Great Schism. Nah, go ahead, it's
Yeah.
fine. Like, what is going on there?
No, it was actually really funny because when I was still a Catholic, like I went to that church, and I'm like, I can't make sense of all this. And David Arahan has a good video on how the Eastern Catholics kind of refute Rome, and this is so true with the Melkites because I talked to the priest and I called them like, how do you like make sense of all this? Like the East, they like the filioque is wrong, and like Vatican I, and like all the changes like from leavened to unleavened bread and like banning infants communion, and the Melkite priest
Right.
literally agreed with me on like everything, and it was just like, so like the Melkites are definitely the closest to the Orthodox, but they still are in
Yeah,
communion with Rome. But
it's a weird paradox because they are basically just in all manner of attitude, prayer style, fasting, liturgy. They're basically still just Byzantine, so they're basically still
yeah,
Orthodox. They haven't changed one thing at all. They just happen to be part of the Catholic Church. My grandmother on my dad's side, she's from a Melkite family, and
yeah,
like, they have just never had a problem with the Orthodox. Some of the Orthodox Arabs in like Syria and Lebanon, they don't dislike Melkites, but they dislike obviously that the Melkites left because they're like,
yeah,
hey, you know, it's bad enough that we're a minority. Like we should stick together here.
yeah,
If you
yeah,
look at Lebanon, the population of the Orthodox would be like 70% larger had the Melkites stayed.
yeah.
So it's like there's obviously some animosity there.
Mm.
And Melkite actually is kind of interesting because it basically just means like a follower of the emperor. It was a derogatory term that the
Oh,
Orientals would call the Greek Orthodox. They would say, "Oh, you're Melkites. You're following the Byzantine Empire," and they really didn't like the Byzantine Empire at all. So,
mm.
yeah. Anyway, that's just the kind of root of that word there.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, it's like that. There's a lot of Eastern Catholics in the Middle East. Maronites are kind of the weirdest ones, but you're right. I mean, Erhan does show how it refutes it because it just doesn't make sense.
yeah.
How can this be a cause for schism? But if people do it like 700 years later, it's totally acceptable.
Exactly. And venerating post-schism saints, it just, yeah, refutes it. But my last question for you is like, what would you say to someone and why they should be Orthodox and not like Catholic or Protestant or Muslim? And I think what the theme of what we talked about is like having that like continuity in understanding history. Like you were talking about, if you look into the history with Islam, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. There are like precursors and things that led to it. And I think if you study history, it will lead you to the Orthodox Church. But what would you say, or what makes why is Orthodoxy so good?
Well, I think that what makes Orthodoxy the truth in a very objective way would just be, like you said, the historicity of it. If you
Mm.
study history, I think history points to the Orthodox Church. In addition to that, we also have, in terms of theology, even before the historical terms. If you look at the Old Testament, the liturgy that the Old Testament Jews are following is mimicking the apostolic liturgy of Christianity. So we know already that if we're going to be in continuity with the Old Testament, we can't be a rabbinic Jew,
Yeah.
can't be a Muslim, can't be a Hindu
Hmm.
or pagan or anything.
Yeah.
And we also can't be a Protestant because they don't have a proper
Yeah.
functioning liturgy, a sacrifice, or any of that.
Hmm.
So if you're just looking at the Old Testament, you can already disqualify pretty much everyone. That leaves you with Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and like the Oriental churches.
Yeah.
And between them, I then we can go into the topic of history, and I think that the historicity of the Orthodox Church is the most supreme. If you look at Catholicism, I believe you had a Catholic, Roman Catholic background before you became
Yeah,
Orthodox.
yeah, yeah. I was atheist, and then I was Catholic. Went to like Latin mass and everything.
Were you
Um,
a rad trad?
yeah, I was. I literally was. And then the more I looked in, I'm like, wait, this is a contradiction. This doesn't make any sense. And then like you were saying, like just seeing like the differences. Like the more I'm learning about the history, we never did like prostrations. There was never this strong emphasis on iconography. That like the West is just it's totally like forgotten the first century.
Right.
Yeah.
And even like yeah, and beyond that, I agree fully. They also have other innovations. Like
Yes.
if you look at the Great Schism, how much has Orthodoxy changed since the Great Schism? Like a hair? I mean, it hasn't
Yeah.
changed really at all.
Hmm.
I mean, if anything, more of our theology has been clarified. We've had
Yeah.
more people discuss it, so we've reached like greater heights of depth, but never have we gone, let's just do new stuff. And so when you
Yeah.
look at Catholicism, you see the rise of, well, first of all, they have the ADS, which is the absolute divine
Yeah.
simplicity. I know Dyer has done like at least 10 2-hour things on this, so I don't even need to cover that. And then you
Yeah.
also have you have ADS, and then you also have natural theology, which is
Yeah.
the separation of my life is theology, this is how I understand the world, looking through the scope of my religion. Two, here's what my religion says, and here's what like atheistic science says, and that leads into secularism, and it led into the Protestant Revolution as
Yeah.
well. So those are massive problems. You also have their Marianology, so their way of the theology of the Blessed Theotokos. They take that too far. I was even speaking to a Coptic priest not long ago, and even he agreed, and that's an Oriental church. He said, "Yeah, the Catholics take that too far. That's
Yeah.
too much for us. You know, this idea that Mary did not need to be saved by Christ. I mean, that isn't that like blasphemous that Christ could not and did not need to save someone? That's a little strange. She's a regular human being, not in the way the Protestants say. She's
Yeah.
not regular like, oh, just
Mhm.
one of those people.
She's
She's
special.
extremely
Yeah.
important, especially yeah, like the greatest of all saints, but
Mhm.
still a human, a
Exactly.
mortal
Yeah.
human. Yeah, not an angel, not anything like
And they
that.
have to like
And
make
so,
they have to make like the immaculate conception, like she was conceived without sin. I mean, that's tied into their like doctrine of like
right.
original guilt, but like I mean, they didn't even come up the immaculate conception was like made ex cathedra like I think in the 1800s or something like so late. Like it's
A
just
little late, yeah.
yeah. Um
Um, yeah, that's for sure. And then there's also I don't know if you agree with me on this. I assume you do. That Catholicism led to a like feminized church in some ways.
yeah, I agree.
Theologies that had nothing to do with biblical literature. And when we look at the Bible, we look at the theology they're practicing, the attitude they have towards culture. Of course, people develop and, we get into Europe and there's different cultures, fine, but the spirituality is still there. And you find that in Catholicism, you have this theology known as the Bride of Christ theology,
Oh
where
yeah.
a
Yes.
lot of like female Europeans Western Europeans would see Christ as like they're betrothed to him. And so Christ kind of became like almost like a husband. And then now you have Protestant women like
Yeah.
in America and in the West, oh, Jesus is my boyfriend. Like not
I
literally, but that
no
kind
no
of attitude it disgusts men. Like who wants to
Yeah,
do that?
but I
You know?
wish this wasn't true. But one of the I forget which Catholic saint it is, but one of them had a vision where she got a wedding ring made out of
Oh
Jesus's
yeah.
foreskin, and I'm like, what? It's yeah, no,
It's a little weird.
it's a totally different spirituality after the schism with especially with like the stigmata and it's just
That's true.
it's kind of like masochist I think it's called where they like want to like
Yeah.
endure as much suffering on the body and like purposely like hurt the body and like I don't know it's not the spirituality of orthodoxy.
Right,
um
and that flagellation and masochism can be rooted in ideas that are even older than that, like their idea of the original sin. But of
yeah,
course, when they say that, they don't mean what we mean. They mean
yeah,
like guilt. Oh,
yes,
this is your fault. Oh, you have failed. Whip, whip, stuff like that. So it sounds like I'm making a meme out of it, but that does actually
yeah,
that is where it comes from. And you have all these self-hating guilt ideas. And honestly, this is going to sound like a bit of a stretch, but I would wager that you can trace the Western guilt concepts of today in secular society to some of that guilt. Not in a religious theological way, but it's a cultural way. But you
yeah,
know how there's all the oh, white people apologize
yeah,
stuff and white people always feeling so guilty and this and that, especially in like recent generations. I mean, this is the kind of guilt that had been appearing in Western Europe. And the weird thing is the Protestants, reformers as they were, trying to change everything, they didn't seem to see this was a problem because they
yeah,
kept all the guilt. They kept Protestantism to me is also an issue because it's like Catholicism, but you chop off a few parts. I mean,
yeah,
they didn't actually become as reformed as you would assume they did. So the whole Western tradition does that, and I've seen Muslim movies where like they'll cover the early invasions and they'll portray a priest as doing stuff like that, and it's like that's historically inaccurate, obviously, because that kind of theology wasn't there yet. But it shows the kind of impact that Western Christianity, by Western, of course, I mean Catholic and Protestant, has on the world, that people think everyone's like a Mormon Protestant
Yeah.
dressing like, a Mormon, or a Catholic with their weird guilt and obsession with their Marianology. So
Yeah.
these are major
I
problems.
mean, when I was growing up, I mean, that was like my presupposition of like that was my prototype of what I thought a Christian was. I thought it was like that evangelical kind of annoying person, even though they were like
Yeah.
wholesome and nice. That was my like that's what I thought a Christian was. But like after becoming a Catholic, and then I did go to a Protestant church before I was Catholic, and then finally becoming Orthodox. It's just the mindset is totally different. And
Yeah.
no, I think it is kind of sad because like the way that Western Christianity went, I think it is kind of like a toxic mindset. It's kind of like OCD and very scrupulous and very controlling, and I think that spirit kind of lives on still in the West, and it's not a good spirit. Like we need the Orthodox spirit of like it's just more chill and okay with mystery, and
Right.
yeah,
This is God. Like
yeah,
that's where their natural theology comes to fail them, because they had to define literally everything. Nothing could be up to
yeah,
mystery. I gotta know, the length of Christ's fingernail. I mean, I'm not trying to be insulting. That's how
yeah.
they
It's
are.
true.
It's like,
Yeah,
why do you care? So
yeah,
it's weird. I mean, and people talk about, well, look at how Catholicism did X, Y, and Z. And I don't want to play the numbers game, because Islam is also massive. So by that logic, it must be true. But
yeah,
I find that's a wrong argument.
yeah,
But if you look at famous historical figures that happen to be Catholic, like Hernan Cortez or Francisco Pizarro, conquistadors of the New World, yeah, they may have been Catholic then, but I bet you if you could go back in time and grab Hernan Cortez and put him right here, show him everything that's happening in the world, he would not want to be a part of today's Catholic Church.
yeah,
So a lot of these trads who like hang on to, well, look at based Cortez, if he was born today, he wouldn't be a Catholic, and if he was, he wouldn't have been Cortez, because this is not the church he grew up in. If anything, he would have looked at Orthodoxy and said, "Hey, these guys are the schismatics from the East, but they are at least keeping the
yeah,
masculinity and the obedience and discipline of Christianity that I knew." And if you look at Cortez and all these guys who came to the New World, they were actually kind of getting away from the like control freak attitudes that were in
yeah.
Western Europe in some spaces. I mean, they just recovered the Iberian Peninsula, and instead of stay there, they're like, no, I'm just gonna go explore the jungle on the other side of the world. And the
Yeah,
way that they worshipped was with great discipline. I mean, not all of them were good people morally, but
yeah.
they spread Catholicism, and it's like you can't hang on to that if you're not doing the Catholicism they were doing. You know what I mean? So it's like they wouldn't identify with as Jay Dyer says, Frank's church. So
Yeah, they
they
wouldn't.
wouldn't.
They wouldn't.
Yeah.
Another thing I always say, like Catholics for like the numbers is it's like, like how many of these are like really like authentic and like keeping it like a lot of it it's becoming Catholicism and is an atheism factory too, and a lot of them are falling
Yeah.
away, and a lot of the Catholics they bring up, well, like, oh, Rome was never conquered, but it's like despite Rome not getting conquered, it's like declining. And I think in the East, despite like Muslim occupation and despite communist occupation, like Orthodoxy is still like thriving, and none of its key teachings or liturgy got subverted. And so I think that's a
Right.
strong testimony that like despite literally the worst conditions, just being under Ottomans and communists, we've preserved all of our teachings and liturgy, and then the Catholic Church can't do that, even though what
Yeah,
they
you're
weren't
right.
occupied by anyone, but except
Yeah,
the
that's a
Pope.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah, that is an excellent argument. I mean, I've seen them all the time say, well, the Orthodox, look at your abortion rates in Eastern Europe. Like, it has not been very long. I know, like,
yeah,
Zoomers who are growing up, what is the USSR? But, like, it wasn't that long ago.
yeah,
And so you're asking an entire half continent plus the Eurasian part of Russia to just magically become, like, a theocracy overnight. It's a little delusional.
yeah,
But the fact is, Russia, even though it's very far from perfect, at least Orthodoxy is growing, and at least the
yeah.
people there don't mock it. Even the atheists there
That's
have
true.
some respect for their culture. You don't see, and this is like disgusting sentence to even utter, but you don't see drag queen fake icons of Jesus like
Yeah,
you see in some like
What?
ex-Catholics just treat their religion with such hatred.
Ex-
And then, yeah, Catholicism has all the power in the world. Great. But what did they do with it? They let themselves be subverted from within
Yeah.
by freaks and lukewarms. And you're right. The 1.3 billion number, I mean, that's not a very conservative number because like if you look at Western Europe, it says apparently France is a 70% Catholic country. Does anyone believe that? I
Yeah.
mean, like see, it's like probably 15% at maximum,
Yeah.
and of those, how many of them are really practicing it? Like, okay, Poland, I'll give it pass.
Yeah.
That's a good
Poland. Yeah.
example of Catholicism, but and Croatia, but
Yeah.
like Italy, Spain, France, like how can you count these
Yeah.
as rigorous Catholics? And I wanted to mention, I saw a documentary, and this was in sub-Saharan Africa. I think it was Uganda. No, it was Tanzania or Mozambique. And a Protestant went there, and I'm not in favor of this guy. And he was preaching, hey, we gotta stop being with the homos and everything. You gotta get right with God. Typical American Protestantism. And so he actually not so typical because a lot of them are really like liberalized today. But
Yeah.
anyway, he was out there in Africa doing this, and he gets on a radio show with a Catholic priest, native to the area, and the Catholic priest from Tanzania. I may be getting the country wrong because I watched it years ago. He basically says, "Look, look, look. I'm not gonna, approve gay marriages, but we have to be loving and we have to accept people as they are." And that's where I had to sit there and draw the line, and that explains so much about the Western theologies today. So in Orthodoxy, yeah, we still say love the sinner but despise the sin.
Yeah.
But you see so many seculars, liberals, Catholics, and Protestants take that too far. Like, okay, why would I even hate the sin? I have to love the sinner, so I have to accept everything. That's
Yeah.
not true. That's not true at all. Because when
Exactly.
you think about it, my parents love me, right? But are they gonna love if I just decide out of nowhere to like amputate my leg? No, you have to stop
Yeah.
people from doing things that harm them, that
Mhm.
become a problem. And that is the issue that I see where Orthodoxy seems to have real, actual love, and these Western theologies have an imitation of love that is just so backward and lukewarm that they're incapable of defending anything.
Yeah, that's not Christian love. Like real love is like when you sometimes the truth hurts. Like you need to be
Yeah.
honest with people, and Orthodoxy is honest about that, about our salvation. Like it's not easy. It's not easy. Like you need to like always shoot for excellence, and like hopefully you'll achieve some level of perfection. But yeah, any any
Right.
any last thoughts before we end
The
it?
last
Yeah,
thing I wanted to
yeah,
say, I'll make this brief. On the topic of like conquistadors and morality, if you look at Orthodoxy, I would defy anyone to come up with a single time when Orthodox Christians, even the great Tsar Empire, went and genocided like tens and twenties of millions of people and wiped out their cultures. Because all the time you see, wow, the Christians did this and that. The East did not.
yeah.
So what the Protestants did to North America, the Russians, you can't say, well, they weren't there, they didn't know what to do. They went to Alaska and they peacefully showed up to the natives and said, here is our religion. Would you please be interested? We want to save your souls.
Yeah.
Rather than showing up and like just shooting everyone and
Yeah.
spreading disease. And so that's one thing I love to bring up because like you see
No,
all
it's
these arguments of,
yeah. No,
oh yeah,
it,
go
it,
ahead.
it's great because people like why is there 1.3 billion Catholics or why are there so many Muslims? Because these religions, the reality is they were spread with a sword. And they could still be true and spread that way, but the reality is that Catholicism what countries were Catholic? It was France, Spain, Italy, all these countries that were massively colonial. So it makes sense that they're going to spread their religion. And so bringing up
Right.
the numbers game, it doesn't deal with the true or falsity of Orthodoxy. Why is Catholicism everywhere? Colonization. Why is Islam everywhere? Because it's a very militaristic. Versus Orthodoxy has always had a history of positive enculturation, where you don't destroy the local culture. We're not going to make you speak Latin. I mean, you can read about Cyril and Methodius when they converted the Slavs, or like you were talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah, Saint Herman in Alaska. He lived with the natives, and he understood them as people. He tried to make it in their language. He didn't want to destroy their culture. He's just trying to, bring out the good in their culture, but also bring Christ to it. And it's nice because, that spirit of Orthodoxy still lives today. Like, people say, well, Orthodoxy doesn't evangelize. Well, have you actually looked into it? Because they do, and they're actually doing a good job. Like, if you look at...
Very good job.
Yeah, if you look at these maps of where the Orthodox Church is, it's in pretty much every country. And they are, retaining the good aspects of the culture while also, spreading Christianity, which I think is a testimony toward how, like...
Exactly. I also wanted to add before we close, it's very fascinating that you brought up the Latinization.
Yeah.
And that applies to Islam too, with Arabic as their holy language. I would argue even more so, because, and this is really this is such a unique thing that anyone who isn't an Arab Christian wouldn't really get, but it's weird to us. Like, the Arabic language for me is associated with family members arguing over whether the coffee is too chalky or hot or not, and it's like, it's just, the language of the people.
Yeah.
But then you see people, and I'm not trying to be overly offensive, but you see people in like Pakistan who are dressing as Saudi Arabs and use half their sentences or like throw in random bits of Arabic in. And it's not like theological terms. It's just and it's not their fault really. That's just how they're taught, that like you have to say these terms in Arabic. They don't have a lot of the native original language version of saying what they're saying. And Orthodox might do it once in a while with like Greek, but we aren't saying that every other word. In the whole talk we've had, neither of us have uttered any Greek because we're just talking like two people who are speaking English. And so it's like the whole thing doesn't make a lot of sense to me, whether it's Latinization or even the Arabization which spread through Islam. Not just people becoming Arabs, but even non-Arabs who are Muslims. They have to know a good amount of Arabic. And in a sense, a lot of them don't identify as Arabs, but they do things that have nothing to do with that culture. And in the example of Pakistan, it makes no sense because the people in Muhammad's time did not wear white thobes with the red, white, checkered keffiyeh. They didn't wear that. So that's just you copying a modern Arab. I mean, it's as if I just decided to LARP as a Russian, and I'm not Russian. I find that Orthodoxy is very organic. And you mentioned St. Cyril. That's a great example of not forcing people. I mean, you can look at Catholicism. A lot of times they act like this is an inferior people. Not just, okay, their religion is screwed up because it's like demonic paganism, but no, the people are inferior. They must be enlightened. And I would argue, I would extrapolate that today, the West does the same thing, except without the cross, it's the rainbow flag.
Anybody, is. It's with the
anybody who does not submit to the rainbow flag, you're mean. Well, what does that really actually mean? It means the West is enlightened, the West is smart. Everyone who doesn't like gays, guess what? You're just a dumb savage. Because the West, we know best. Accept the flag. So it's the same thing.
It's woke imperialism, but it's just nice because the East has never. I mean, maybe in some cases, but they haven't been that same way that the West and even the Arabs have, where we have to say all our prayers in Arabic, or we have to say all our prayers in Latin. Like Orthodoxy has, everyone's culture has good aspects, so let's retain that culture, but just bring them Christ. So I'd love to have you on again sometime.
Awesome.
It was a lot of fun, but thank you. God bless.